During the 18th century, at the intersection of Enlightenment science, Baroque artistry, and medical necessity, a unique form of anatomical model emerged in Europe, the anatomical Venus. These were life-sized wax models of beautiful young women with removable parts, revealing intricately detailed internal organs. Their startling combination of aesthetic beauty and scientific precision made them popular attractions that served both medical education and public fascination with the human body. The most renowned examples were created by Clemente Susini and his workshop at La Specola Museum in Florence, Italy, beginning in the 1780s. Under the direction of the anatomist Felice Fontana, these artisans created wax figures of extraordinary detail and unsettling beauty. Unlike typical medical models, these Venuses were deliberately aestheticized, portrayed with peaceful expressions, parted lips, flowing hair, real human hair, and adorned with pearl necklaces or silk ribbons. They reclined on silk or velvet cushions in rosewood and Venetian glass cases, their poses reminiscent of classical sculptures of sleeping Venus. What made these models particularly remarkable was their design for disassembly. The torso could be opened to reveal meticulously crafted internal organs, each removable to show deeper layers of anatomy. The most complex models contained up to 200 individually removable parts, allowing for comprehensive study of human anatomy. Some included special features such as a pregnant Venus with a removable fetus, designed for teaching obstetrics to medical students. The anatomical accuracy of these models was extraordinary. Organs were colored realistically. Blood vessels were threaded with silk of different colors to distinguish arteries from veins, and minute structures were rendered with surprising precision. Before refrigeration and modern preservation techniques, these models offered medical students a way to study anatomy without the odor, decay, and ethical complications of actual cadavers. Among the most startling phenomena in mortuary science is what funeral professionals sometimes call the Lazarus syndrome. When corpses appear to move, make sounds, or even sit up hours after death, these occurrences have fueled countless ghost stories and contributed to historical fears of premature burial, but they have entirely natural, if unsettling, physiological explanations. After clinical death, the human body undergoes a complex series of changes, as cellular death occurs gradually. One rare but dramatic post-mortem event is cadaveric spasm, also called instantaneous rigor. Unlike standard rigor mortis, which develops over 2 to 6 hours after death, cadaveric spasm occurs instantly at the moment of death, preserving the last muscular action of life. This phenomenon is typically observed in victims of extreme trauma or intense emotion. Drowning victims may be found still clutching vegetation from their final moments, and soldiers have been discovered on battlefields with weapons still firmly gripped. More common and perhaps more disturbing are post-mortem movements that occur hours after death. These happen when muscles, which function through contraction and relaxation, suddenly contract due to biochemical changes in the body. As ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the molecule that provides energy for muscle function, depletes after death, muscle fibers become more sensitive to calcium ions. When these ions move across cell membranes during decomposition, they can trigger sudden muscle contractions. The most dramatic manifestation occurs when muscles in the back, neck, and legs contract simultaneously. This can cause a corpse to sit upright or raise its arms, movements eerily similar to a person reaching out or trying to rise. The French neurologist Guillaume Benjamin Amand Duchenne documented these effects in the 19th century through electrical stimulation of corpses, demonstrating that specific muscle groups could be activated even after death. In the shadow of the Enlightenment scientific revolution, a macabre profession emerged to satisfy the growing demands of medical schools across Britain and America: the resurrectionist, or body snatcher. These individuals operated in a moral and legal gray area, exhuming the recently buried to provide cadavers for anatomical study during a critical period in medical history when legal sources of bodies were severely restricted. Before the Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain, medical schools faced a severe shortage of anatomical specimens. The only legal source of cadavers was executed criminals, explicitly sentenced to the additional punishment of dissection after death. As the medical profession expanded and execution rates declined in the early 19th century, the gap between supply and demand widened dramatically. A typical anatomy professor might need up to 30 bodies per teaching season, but only 2 to 3 were legally available. This shortage created a black market where fresh corpses could fetch between 8 to 25 pounds, depending on condition and rarity, equivalent to several months' wages for a working-class person. The trade was so profitable that organized gangs specialized in this work, developing techniques to minimize detection and maximize efficiency. Professional resurrectionists typically operated between 2 and 4 a.m., working quickly in small groups. With specialized tools, they would dig only at the head end of the grave, creating a hole just large enough to access the coffin. Upon reaching the coffin, they would break open only the upper portion, using iron hooks to pull the corpse out by the neck or shoulders. The shroud and any valuables were left behind, as taking these constituted theft under the law, while taking only the body was merely a misdemeanor. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg, part of the Holy Roman Empire, experienced one of the strangest medical mysteries in history. It all started when a woman named Frau Trophea began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. What seemed like an isolated incident quickly escalated as more and more people joined in, unable to stop themselves. Within a month, nearly 400 individuals were dancing non-stop, with some collapsing from exhaustion, suffering heart attacks, or even dying. The authorities, unsure of how to handle the crisis, turned to medical professionals, who attributed the condition to hot blood and bizarrely recommended more dancing as a cure. The historical context of this outbreak provides clues to its cause. At the time, Strasbourg was plagued by severe hardships, including famine, disease, and deep religious turmoil. The psychological distress caused by these factors may have triggered what is now known as mass psychogenic illness, where extreme stress manifests as physical symptoms in a group. Similar outbreaks had occurred in medieval Europe, often linked to times of crisis. Many believe the event was tied to Saint Vitus, a saint associated with both epilepsy and dancing frenzies, leading to speculation that this was a form of religious hysteria. The epidemic eventually ended when the remaining dancers were taken to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus and given holy water and prayers. Though the event remains a historical enigma, modern psychology and sociology provide strong evidence. The 18th and 19th centuries witnessed a population gripped by a specific horrifying fear, being buried alive. This condition, known as taphophobia, from the Greek taphos meaning grave, wasn't merely a psychological curiosity, but a rational concern in an era when medical science lacked reliable methods to confirm death. Newspapers regularly published accounts of near-miss burials and exhumed coffins, showing signs of desperate struggle, scratched lids, torn fabric, and bodies in contorted positions suggesting the occupant had awakened after burial. The problem was common enough that in 1895, a physician named J.V. Laborde documented 46 cases of near-premature burial and 2 actual premature burials within just a single year in France. This widespread fear drove innovation, leading to an entire industry of safety coffins, with various mechanisms to allow the mistakenly buried to signal for help. More elaborate systems emerged as the 19th century progressed. German inventor Franz Wester created a system with a rope attached to the corpse's hands, feet, and head. Any movement would trigger above-ground bells and raise a flag. A small dome above the grave contained food, water, and a ladder for escape if cemetery workers weren't immediately available. Another design by Count Michel de Carnis-Carnicki automatically opened the coffin lid and raised an air tube with a bell if movement was detected. Mary Shelley, the visionary author who gave the world Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, at just 18 years old, carried a deeply personal and macabre memento from her tragic marriage, her husband's calcified heart, which she reportedly kept wrapped in silk in her desk drawer for many years after his death. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romantic poet and Mary's husband, drowned in a sailing accident off the coast of Italy in July 1822. As Percy's body burned, his heart appeared to resist the flames. Some accounts suggest this anomaly may have been due to an undiagnosed calcification condition that had affected his heart. Edward Trelawney, a friend present at the cremation, reportedly reached into the flames and snatched the heart from the pyre. This preserved heart eventually made its way to Mary, who treasured it as her most precious possession. She kept it wrapped in silk along with a copy of Percy's poem, Adonais, in her writing desk drawer, where it remained for nearly 30 years until her death in 1851. After Mary's passing, the heart was found in her desk, wrapped in the pages of one of Percy's final poems. The relic was finally buried with their son, Sir Percy Florence Shelley, in 1889, finally reuniting father and son in a way. The authenticity of the heart has been debated by some scholars, with alternative theories. One of the most unsettling post-mortem occurrences is the phenomenon known medically as posthumous birth, or coffin birth, post-mortem fetal extrusion. This rare event occurs when a deceased pregnant woman's decomposing body expels the fetus through the birth canal after death, creating the appearance of having given birth in the coffin. The mechanism behind this grim process is entirely physical. After death, the human body begins to decompose, producing gases within the abdominal and chest cavities, primarily methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide. As these gases accumulate, pressure increases within the abdominal cavity. In a pregnant woman, this building pressure can force the uterine contents downward through the path of least resistance, the birth canal. This phenomenon was documented more frequently in historical records before modern embalming became standard practice. Medieval and Renaissance reports occasionally noted the discovery of infant remains between the legs of a buried mother when graves were relocated or exhumed. Historical medical literature from the 18th and 19th centuries contains several case studies, with physicians theorizing about the mechanisms involved. A particularly well-documented case occurred in Brussels in 1633, when a woman who died in late pregnancy was buried in a shallow grave. 3 days later, the partially expelled fetus was discovered when the grave was disturbed. Similar cases were recorded during epidemics when hasty mass burials without embalming were common. Modern embalming largely prevents coffin birth, as the chemical process removes the bacteria responsible for putrefaction and the production of decomposition gases. Additionally, contemporary mortuary practices often include procedures to prevent such occurrences in cases of maternal death during pregnancy. In ancient Rome, the blood-stained sand of the arena was more than just the remnant of violent entertainment. It was a prized medical commodity. Roman physicians and their patients believed that gladiatorial blood possessed special healing properties, making it one of history's more unusual pharmaceutical ingredients. After gladiatorial combats, attendants would rush into the arena with specially designed sponges and vessels to collect the spilled blood before it dried or became contaminated with sand. This blood was then sold to wealthy patrons and physicians for medicinal use. The fresher the blood, the more potent it was believed to be, and blood from a particularly strong or famous gladiator commanded premium prices. The main application for this macabre medicine was in treating epilepsy, then called the sacred disease or falling sickness. Physicians prescribed drinking the warm blood of a fallen gladiator immediately after his death, believing it transferred the gladiator's strength and vitality to the patient. Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman naturalist, wrote that epileptics would drink the blood of gladiators. The treatment wasn't limited to epilepsy. Gladiatorial blood was also recommended for various forms of paralysis, impotence, and infertility. Some Roman physicians prescribed it as a general strengthening tonic or cure for lethargy. The Roman author Celsus suggested it for certain types of tumors, while others claimed it improved virility. Among the most sophisticated biological detection systems on Earth are the noses of specially trained cadaver dogs, whose abilities border on the supernatural when it comes to locating human remains. These canines, often referred to as human remains detection, HRD, dogs, can detect decomposition odors at concentration levels that defy our technological capabilities. The science behind this remarkable skill lies in dogs' olfactory system. While humans have approximately 6 million olfactory receptors, dogs possess up to 300 million depending on the breed. Their brain's olfactory bulb, which processes scent information, is proportionally 40 times larger than ours. This gives cadaver dogs the ability to detect decomposition compounds at concentrations as low as 1 part per trillion. What makes this even more impressive is that these dogs can isolate the scent of human decomposition from other animal remains or environmental odors. They're detecting a complex signature of approximately 400 volatile organic compounds, VOCs, produced during human decomposition. These dogs assist in locating victims after natural disasters, recover ancient burial sites for archaeological research, and even help identify unmarked graves at historical sites. Some specialized units work exclusively on cold cases, finding remains that have been missing for decades. Beneath the romantic streets of Paris lies a vast macabre network of tunnels housing the remains of approximately 6 million former Parisians. These catacombs, often called the Empire of the Dead, represent one of history's largest and most organized cemetery relocations. Born of necessity during a public health crisis in the late 18th century. By the 1780s, Paris faced a serious problem. Its cemeteries, particularly the centrally located Saint-Innocent, had been receiving bodies for nearly 10 centuries and were dangerously overcrowded. The situation reached a breaking point when the weight of a mass grave collapsed a basement wall of a neighboring property, sending decomposing remains spilling into the building. The overpowering stench and deteriorating sanitary conditions in the area convinced authorities to act. The solution was found in the abandoned limestone quarries that had provided building material for Paris for centuries. These quarries created a vast network of tunnels beneath the city. Beginning in 1786, under cover of darkness, wagons covered in black cloth transported remains from the cemeteries to these underground chambers. What makes the catacombs particularly striking isn't just the scale, but the organization. Workers didn't simply deposit bones haphazardly. Instead, they arranged them in elaborate artistic patterns. Skulls and femurs stacked in decorative walls, with other bones placed behind them. Plaques with philosophical reflections on mortality were installed throughout, such as the famous entrance inscription, Arrête, c'est ici l'empire de la mort. Stop, this is the empire of death. During the devastating waves of bubonic plague that swept through Europe in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, distinctive figures stalked the streets of infected cities, plague doctors in their bizarre bird-like masks. These eerie coverings weren't designed merely to frighten. They represented the medical understanding of the time and served several practical purposes according to contemporary theory. The most distinctive feature was the long beak-shaped nose, typically 6 to 8 inches in length. This wasn't a whimsical design choice but reflected the dominant miasma theory of disease transmission, which held that illness spread through foul air, or miasma. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, flowers, spices, and even sponges soaked in vinegar, substances believed to purify the air before it reached the doctor's lungs. Common ingredients included juniper berry, ambergris, roses, mint, camphor, cloves, myrrh, and laudanum. Some doctors even placed burning materials in the beak's tip, believing the smoke would provide additional protection. The complete plague doctor costume included a wide-brimmed hat, signifying their profession, a long waxed coat, gloves, and a wooden cane. The cane served multiple functions, examining patients from a distance, taking pulses without direct contact, and occasionally directing family members or orderlies in handling the infected. Among the world's rarest and most terrifying neurological disorders is fatal familial insomnia, FFI, a condition so uncommon it has been identified in only about 40 families worldwide. This genetic prion disease literally kills by preventing sleep, leading to a cascade of physiological failures that inevitably end in death. The disease typically manifests in middle age, though cases have been documented from the late 20s to the 70s. The onset is often subtle. Slight difficulties with concentration, memory problems, or small muscle jerks that might be dismissed as stress or aging. Within months, however, patients develop progressively worsening insomnia that proves completely resistant to medication. This isn't ordinary sleeplessness, but a fundamental inability of the brain to enter sleep states. Even the most powerful sedatives fail to induce sleep. The disease's progression follows 4 distinct stages over 12 to 18 months. In the first stage, patients experience increasing insomnia, paranoia, and panic attacks, often accompanied by unusual phobias. The second stage brings hallucinations and severe panic episodes as sleep becomes virtually impossible. By the third stage, complete insomnia sets in with rapid weight loss despite constant hunger. Patients may consume enormous quantities of food, but continue losing weight as their metabolic systems malfunction. The final stage is perhaps the most horrifying. As total sleep deprivation continues, patients develop dementia and become unresponsive while remaining technically awake. Their bodies enter an autopilot state with peculiar, reflexive movements. Temperature regulation fails, causing profuse sweating followed by hyperthermia. Ultimately, the brain's regulation of autonomic functions deteriorates completely, leading to coma and death. What makes FFI particularly cruel is that patients remain cognitively aware through much of their decline. They understand they aren't sleeping and witness their own physical and mental deterioration while being powerless to stop it. Silvano, an Italian patient whose case was extensively documented, kept detailed logs tracking his awareness of his decline until his handwriting became unintelligible. Mount Everest, the highest peak on Earth, harbors a grim secret above 8,000 meters in what mountaineers call the death zone. In this forbidding realm where oxygen levels are insufficient to sustain human life for extended periods, approximately 200 climbers who never made it down remain preserved in the extreme cold. The frigid temperatures and dry air create natural mummification, preventing decomposition and keeping many bodies remarkably intact, sometimes for decades. Most attempts to recover these remains prove too dangerous, as the altitude and conditions pose severe risks to rescue teams. What makes this particularly haunting is that these bodies have become unofficial landmarks on climbing routes. Experienced guides often reference them when directing climbers. "Turn left at green boots" refers to a climber in green climbing boots who perished in 1996 and remained visible along the northeast route for years. Another known landmark was Sleeping Beauty, the body of Francis Arsentiev, who died in 1998 after successfully reaching the summit. Throughout history, humans have preserved their dead through various methods: mummification, embalming, and even cryonic freezing. However, one of the most unsettling preservation practices is human taxidermy, the process of preserving and displaying human remains in ways similar to mounted animal specimens. This practice, though rare, has manifested across different cultures and historical periods, raising profound questions about bodily autonomy after death. Among the most renowned practitioners was Dr. Frederick Ruijs, a 17th-century Dutch anatomist who created elaborate dioramas using preserved human body parts. Ruijs developed an innovative embalming technique involving a secret formula of alcohol and other preservatives that maintain the lifelike appearance and flexibility of tissues. He used this method to create his botanical specimens, arrangements of dried arteries and veins from children's organs designed to resemble plants and trees. More disturbing were his tableaux, artistic arrangements featuring fetal and infant skeletons posed as if alive, often in allegorical scenes regarding death and the brevity of life. One famous example showed a fetal skeleton holding its own preserved arterial system like a bouquet while weeping into a handkerchief made of preserved brain membrane. These were not hidden medical specimens, but public attractions that drew visitors from across Europe, including Peter the Great of Russia, who purchased Reich's entire collection in 1717 for 30,000 guilders, a fortune at the time. English philosopher Jeremy Bentham took a different approach to human preservation, arranging for his own taxidermy after death. In his will, Bentham requested the creation of an auto-icon, his preserved body dressed in his own clothes and displayed in a glass-fronted cabinet. Following his death in 1832, his skeleton was padded with hay, dressed, and topped with a wax head, the preservation of his actual head having failed. This auto icon still sits at University College London, occasionally brought to attend meetings of the College Council where he is recorded as present but not voting. During the Victorian era of the 19th century, photography was an expensive, rare technology that most families might access only a few times in their lives. This scarcity, combined with high infant and child mortality rates, gave rise to the poignant practice of postmortem photography. When a loved one passed away, especially a child, families would arrange for photographers to capture an image before burial, and often the only photograph they would ever have of that person. These images were treasured keepsakes, displayed prominently in homes as tangible memories of the deceased. The photographers employed various techniques to make the departed appear lifelike. They would pose the deceased in chairs, propped up with hidden supports, or arrange them in beds as if sleeping. Special stands called posing sticks were used to keep bodies upright. In family portraits with the deceased, living relatives would sometimes be slightly blurred due to movement during the long exposure times, while the deceased person would appear eerily sharp and clear. Between the 11th and 19th centuries in the snow-covered mountains of northern Japan, a small group of Buddhist monks practiced perhaps the most extreme form of asceticism ever documented, self-mummification. This process, called sokushinbutsu, literally a Buddha in this very body, involved a monk intentionally transforming himself into a mummy while still alive through a meticulous method developed over centuries. Adherents of the Shingon sect of Buddhism, particularly in Japan's Yamagata prefecture, believe this practice was a path to becoming a living Buddha. Unlike suicide, which Buddhism generally prohibits, self-mummification was considered a spiritual transformation, the culmination of a monk's dedication to abandoning attachment to physical needs and desires. The process began with a 1,000-day period called Mokuji Kigyo, eating trees. During this phase, monks eliminated all grains and cereals from their diet, subsisting on nuts, berries, bark, and pine needles gathered from sacred mountains. This strict regimen dramatically reduced body fat and began to dehydrate their tissues. Throughout this period, the monks maintained rigorous physical activity, including meditation, prayers, and physical labor, further reducing body mass. The second 1,000-day period intensified these restrictions. The monk's diet was reduced to tiny amounts of bark, roots, and sometimes stones believed to have spiritual properties. They drank limited quantities of salinized water from local hot springs, which both aided dehydration and acted as a natural preservative for their tissues. Most critically, they began consuming urushi tea, made from the sap of the urushi or lacquer tree, Toxicodendron vernicifluum. This sap, the same substance used to create lacquerware, contains powerful toxic compounds that cause vomiting and further dehydration. More importantly, it rendered the body toxic to bacteria and insects that would normally cause decomposition after death. The monks understood through centuries of observation that this substance would help preserve their bodies.